Now, the Japanese prime minister says he's outraged at the killing of the pilot. The country has lost 2 of its own citizens at the hands of Islamic State militants in recent days. The killings fanned calls for Japan to change its pacifist constitution and allow its long-constrained military to conduct overseas rescue missions, something that really irks nearby China. Well, let's get more perspective from James Corbett, editor of the Independent News website based in Japan. James, thanks for joining us here on our team. So, what's going to be happening in Japan as a result of the killings? Will they push Japan into changing its long-held pacifist stance? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's absolutely what the Abe government is going to try to push, especially since the latest session of the Japanese Diet has just convened. And in this session, which will last about 150 days, the Diet is going to be looking at 70 to 80 bills, at least 10 of which directly concern the Japanese security issues and the issue of the self-defense force. As just last year, the Abe government began a push to try to reinterpret the Japanese constitution, which has hardwired pacifism into the DNA of the Japanese state for the past 70 years, and to try to make it more militarily aggressive. And this seems like almost like a late Christmas present for the Abe government, because it stirs up the Japanese population and makes that militarization agenda more palatable to a traditionally pacifist nation.
Well, there is also speculation in Japan's media that the authorities knew about the kidnappings but kept quiet to provoke the hostage crisis. Can you comment on that?
Yes, in fact, that's not speculation at this point. The Shukan Post had, which is a weekly magazine here in Japan, had a pretty explosive story last week that they had found out about this kidnapping back in November of last year and had gone to the Japanese government for comment, and were told to keep quiet about it because the Japanese Foreign Ministry was secretly negotiating for the release of these hostages. And so going on that information, the Japanese government absolutely positively did know about this in at least November of last year. Despite that, the Prime Minister Abe embarked on a Middle Eastern trip that had long been planned, during which, on January 17th, he announced in Cairo $200 million of aid to those countries fighting ISIS, a move that was absolutely guaranteed to provoke the type of response that we saw unfold just in the past week or two. So absolutely, the Japanese government did know and still acted deliberately to provoke the very situation that we've ended up in, which again goes to show, I think, that what has happened is going to be used in furtherance of the Abe government's military agenda.
So if it does, I mean, if Japan does start giving its military more freedom, how will this affect the region, the countries nearby?
Well, the reinterpretation of Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which is the operative part, is supposedly going to talk about collective self-defense as a valid use of the Japanese military. The Japanese military at this point is supposedly prohibited from any overseas militarily aggressive operations. But under this new interpretation, anytime any one of their allies is potentially threatened, the Japanese military can come to the aid of that partner anywhere in the world. And so I think, obviously, countries like China, I think, have good reason to be worried about this, because obviously this is a step towards the outright militarization of Japan. And this has to be seen as being aimed at Japan's main regional rival, China. And of course, we've seen the growing tensions in the East China Sea over the last few years over some of the disputed islands here. So I think that absolutely China is in the crosshairs of this, and that's why I think the Chinese media is quite concerned about these recent developments.
And what about the people in Japan? How will they take that?
Well, it seems that the Japanese public is not reacting in quite the same way as the Japanese political class. The Japanese politicians and other politically connected insiders are calling this Japan's 9/11 and things of that nature. The Japanese public is actually quite furious with the Abe government and the way that they handled the entire situation. And I think a lot of people realize that this is being used for political purposes. And one of the most disgusting parts of this whole story is that the legacy legacy of a journalist like Kenji Goto, who devoted years of his life to just documenting the horrors and tragedy and senselessness of war, is going to be used to further a war agenda. And I think a lot of people are actually quite outraged about that. So this might backfire in the long run, or it might stir up Japanese public opinion. I think that remains to be seen.
All right, James Corbet, editor of the Corbet Report, an independent news and information website based in Japan. Thank you so much for joining us here on RT International and giving us your thoughts on the regional issues.
Now that we've talked about the basic definition of a democracy, we're going to talk about two types of democracy. And this is all covered under standard SS6 CG4, comparing and contrasting presidential and parliamentary democracies. A presidential democracy is a system of government in which the president is constitutionally independent of the legislature. In contrast, a parliamentary system is a system of government where the executive power is a part of the legislative and lawmaking branch. Now we're going to dive into specific examples of each of these two types of democracy. The first is the presidential democracy. We're very familiar with the presidential democracy, as the United States is considered a presidential democracy. And I have Barack Obama on the left, and he is saying to veto or to pass. He is the executive branch, and he is completely separate from the legislative branch, which would be the United States Congress. So one thing you need to keep in mind with the presidential democracy is the president, the executive branch, is completely separate from the legislative branch. Also, the president is voted in and elected by the people, and so are the legislative members. Our Congress, which is our legislative branch, is composed of the House of Representatives and the Senate, both of which are voted on by constituents of each state. Now, President Obama can say, hey, this law should be made, and he can run and talk to Congress and say, hey, can you write up a bill for this law? Congress, in turn, will write up a bill or say, don't think so. And once they're done writing up the bill, if they decide to, they can send it back to President Obama, who in turn would either sign or not sign the bill. And that would contribute to whether or not the bill is passed. In addition, legislative branch or Congress can also write up bills that they choose to write up based on whatever laws need to be passed. For example, gay marriage is a big one with the different local governments, such as state. With the legislative branch, once they write up the bill, they send it back to the president, and the president will either sign or not sign. So they can write the bills and send it over, or he can ask for the bills to be written and have it sent over for approval. But ultimately, there are two separate components of government. The parliamentary democracy is completely different. They have an executive power, but the executive power is actually a part of that legislative branch. It is the Prime Minister is David Cameron for the United Kingdom. He was the majority ruling party, basically came in and decided to nominate him or have him step up and lead and become the executive power. Now, when Parliament, which is what the legislative branch is called, or which is part of the legislative branch with Mr. Cameron, when they vote on a law or they're trying to pass a bill, what happens is the Prime Minister votes along with the Parliament. So there's the integration, they're interrelated, and the Prime Minister votes on the laws within the legislative branch. With the United States, Barack Obama, completely separate, a separate entity, a separate branch. The Prime Minister, although he is the executive power, he is a part of the legislative branch. Here's our little Parliament members. And Parliament also has cabinet members that are appointed. We will discuss that further in class. In class, you were given a Venn diagram. If you would go ahead and get that out and begin filling it in. The presidential and parliamentary differences that exist. Number one, we're gonna go ahead and apply this to the United States and the United Kingdom and extend that example a little further. The United States is a federal democracy. We talked about systems of government. So a federal is when the power is shared. That should be a review. And then the United Kingdom is a unitary. So the power is not necessarily shared. The central government is the stronger, has most of the power. So in a presidential democracy, you have the president who is elected by the people, in contrast to the parliamentary democracy, where the prime minister is not directly voted by the people. In a parliamentary democracy, whichever party has the majority, and the UK has a lot of political parties, the majority party will then appoint a prime minister who is sanctioned by the head of state, which is actually separate from the head of government. So in addition to having an executive power, they also have, or the head of government, they also have a head of state who's more of a figurehead and participates in ceremonial things such as the appointment of prime minister. And that would be Queen Elizabeth II, who is right here. Lovely Queen Elizabeth II. And in a presidential democracy, Congress has no part in the election of the president. So the election that takes place for our president and the election that takes place for our Congress members are completely two separate elections. And with the parliamentary democracy, there's only one election, and that one election selects legislative members of Parliament, and from Parliament or within Parliament, the Prime Minister rises. Like I said, the Prime Minister is not directly voted for by the citizens. Also, in a presidential democracy, there are differing political parties for president or Congress, or differing political parties could exist. For example, the president could be a Democrat, and the majority of Congress, or most of the Congress members in the House or the Senate, could be Republican. So you could have a dual power. Power doesn't necessarily reside with one majority party. In a parliamentary democracy, one political party holds the power. Also, an office term. A presidential term is considered 4 years in the United States. So after 4 years, we have another election, and we either re-elect the current president or we get a new one, with a total term being 8 years. A person can't serve longer than 8 years as the president. In a parliamentary democracy, there is no term or limit. So as long as the prime minister has the confidence and backing of Parliament, they can continue to be prime minister for as long as they have that support. In a presidential democracy, the president answers to the people, where in contrast, in a parliamentary, the prime minister would answer to Parliament. Now, there are some shared characteristics between a presidential and a parliamentary democracy. They're both representative democracies, and we talked about representative democracies previously, and a representative democracy is where people vote on someone to go and represent their ideas or their beliefs in government. And both parliamentary and presidential have that characteristic. They vote for parliament. They both vote for legislative members, and then in a presidential democracy, we also have a separate election for our president. Head of state. They both have head of state. President, prime minister. It doesn't matter what it's called, or actually, president and Queen Elizabeth would be the head of state, but the figurehead. But they both have executive powers as well, the president or the prime minister. A bicameral form of government also exists in both democracies, and they are also ruled by a constitution. I hope this helps with your differentiating between a presidential and parliamentary democracy, and good luck on your upcoming exam.